Greetings, Deep Ones, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
It's been a little while since we've checked in with White Dwarf, so let's see what it's been up to.
Many years ago we did a video on the very first issue of White Dwarf from 1977. At that point, Games Workshop didn't have physical stores, didn't make minis, and didn't even have Warhammer yet, so the issue was mostly full of Dungeons & Dragons since they were the European distributors for it at the time. All of which made the issue all but unrecognisable next to the slick Warhammer-laden magazine of today.
So we thought it might be interesting to skip forward a bit in the timeline to see where White Dwarf was by, say, issue 50. After all, by then they had physical stores, they had Citadel miniatures, they had Warhammer, and they'd lost the exclusive D&D license. Also, this is old enough that old issues of it aren't super expensive to pick up physical copies of. I mean, I suppose seeing as this is just all through video to you guys, it doesn't really matter if we have a physical copy or a PDF. But it is really nice to have something to physically hold during these segments, you know?
Issue 50 of White Dwarf was released in February of 1984 and was sold for 75p. The cover art was by Terry Oakes and featured a large muscular pigman looming over a mansion where the person at the window is no doubt wondering why the weatherman said nothing about giant ominous skyballs. Whilst the magazine is still mostly in black and white at this point, it does have a smidge more colour than issue 1 did. I'll tell you this now so you don't get too excited when you see a bit of colour later. You know what you're like.
Once again, it starts off with several pages of adverts, this time for Traveller, Tunnels and Trolls, a Call of Cthulhu adventure, Games Workshop themselves, and for some software and book packages. It was the 80s after all, microcomputers were all the rage, as well as a couple that are worth a little more scrutiny. Krasimov's World was a play-by-mail role-playing game, and as far as anyone can tell, was the first of its type. The full-time game master mentioned was its creator Kevin Cropper, who was able to go full-time after he advertised in White Dwarf previously. This early version was all handwritten, but a later computerized version of the game was still in operation until 2004. Again, old magazines can cause you to fall down wiki holes, so I would personally recommend using the buddy system.
Thanks.
The other ad, we'll get back to that one.
The first article in the issue itself is A Few Small Formalities by Garth Nix, and it's a little bit genius. It is a small scenario for the sci-fi role-playing game Traveller, wherein the party encounter a fiercely bureaucratic civilization full of red tape, where they must fill out multiple forms just to do anything. For example, if the player characters don't have a pen on them, then they are to be handed Form A88909, the pen requisition form, which they, of course, cannot fill in, because they don't have a pen. This whole thing was really an excuse to screw with the players who may be able to deal with a dangerous space pirate gang with a mixture of cunning and extreme violence, but wouldn't really have a good answer for when a polite bureaucrat tells them that their form has been rejected for the third time because they ticked a box in a non-regulation way. Plus, there are some traps hidden in the forms, like if you put your age as 180 or over, something that to our understanding can just happen in Traveller, then you would be killed by the state because, according to this civilization's rules, anyone who's 180 years old would be dead. And you may not try and prove otherwise under the legal death age regulations of the Euthanasia/Involuntary Passing Act. Basically, the general idea here is that whether the players played along and managed to navigate this nightmare of forms, or just got frustrated and resorted to combat to get past it, they would be having an interesting role-playing experience. Just maybe don't do this kind of thing too often. Oh, also, a patron pointed out to us that the author of this article, Garth Nix, is apparently a pretty well-known kids' fantasy author these days, which is neat. It's always fun to see where these folks ended up.
Next, we get some reviews, like for Steve Jackson's Sorcery, a game book related to the Fighting Fantasy series, i.e. a choose-your-own-adventure with dice. There's also a review of various books for the old Middle-earth roleplay system, which we mention purely because the game has one of our favourite acronyms. MERP. On the Middle-earth topic, much later in the issue, there's also a review of The Fellowship of the Ring by Iron Crown Enterprises, which is apparently quite good. We even get a series of book reviews, as in fiction ones, not rules ones, although we can't really comment on these as we haven't read any of the books featured. What we can comment on though is the next article, which we've previously talked about in a couple of other videos, since it's the Fiend Factory column where they statted out various characters from White Dwarf for AD&D and RuneQuest.
The first character is the White Dwarf himself, Grombrindle, although he hadn't picked up that name yet or his impressively tall hair. Nobody knows which god he serves, but the truth is he is one of the few clerics of Throrrigger, an extremely obscure dwarven demigod of games and bad jokes. He's also made his own futuristic role-playing game, called Dole Checks and Demos. Did we mention this was written in 1980s Britain? The next character is the goblin Gobbledygook and his little partner Nibble, who they just call Gobbledygook's familiar rather than by his actual name, which we thought was strange until we realised that Nibble's name wasn't actually printed until issue 51. Also, any of you who watched our video on Gobbledygook will probably find this sentence in his description quite odd.
Gobbledygook is not in any sense vicious. All he wants from life is a good lunch, or 3, and a little peace and quiet. Honestly, same.
Which is, again, we feel, a result of this being written when there was only a handful of Gobbledygook strips released. You can sort of interpret him this way from the first few, but by the end there's no way to interpret him other than a character who actively causes trouble because he's just a bit of a prick.
Next, there was at the time GW owner and White Dwarf editor Ian Livingston. We talked about this entry in our Fiend Factory video. Then there's Thrud the Barbarian, the star of the comic of the same name. His loincloth counts as a shield in the RuneQuest version as an explanation as to how fantasy barbarians can survive despite not even wearing trousers. They then stat out a couple of characters not from White Dwarf. Griselda and Wolfhead were given rules for D&D as they were from a RuneQuest scenario pack GW published in the UK. Finally, we have the characters Agaroth the Unwashed and Ugbash Facesplitter, who were a pair of the characters that we used to personify the Games Workshop mail-order service at the time. Basically precursors to the old mail-order trolls. Agaroth the Unwashed was a half-orc or ogre, depending on what game you're playing, and was rather unpleasant.
Agaroth the Unwashed is nasty. We mean really foul. Think of the nastiest person you know, double it, add bad manners, and Agaroth is still much, much worse. If we told you the nicest thing Agaroth has done in the last year, you wouldn't want to eat for a week. Ugh. Just thinking about it makes us feel ill. Agaroth not only eats babies, he doesn't wash his hands afterwards.
Ugbash Facesplitter was a human who splits faces and breaks through the fourth wall by demanding the writers of the article cease their drivelling. So we should probably stop talking about him as well.
The next article is Divinations and the Divine, which looks at clerics in AD&D and how they're actually super interesting to play if you think about it. Joking aside, it's a little guide showing you how clerics, which they say were underplayed at the time, were a very helpful and fun class to play once you stopped thinking about them as just a healer. Not least since in the real world, religion has affected everyday life and politics throughout history, and in the D&D world, where physical manifestations of the supernatural, well, objectively and provably exist whether or not you believe in them, then clerics will be able to play an even bigger role. Also, detect magic is super useful.
The Watchers of Walberswick was an adventure for Call of Cthulhu by John Sutherland. In this adventure, set in 1934, a group of people from the Bedford Archaeological Research Society investigate a mysterious unidentified bone found in a museum. It's unidentified because, spoilers, it's secretly from a deep one, a group of which happen to live in the area. The party must find Reggie, the fisherman who brought the bone back, and acquire evidence of the eldritch horror that it came from. What's neat is that the map you're given is actually a relatively accurate one of the area around Walberswick, a real village in Suffolk. And yeah, to those outside of the UK, it's perfectly normal to have a place called Dingle Hill, or its superior, the Dingle Great Hill. England's just that kind of country. We did initially wonder why they chose this bit of the country specifically, but then we noticed this was around the River Dunwich, and yeah, then it made sense.
RuneQuest hardware was, as it sounds, a list of handy little devices for you to add to games of RuneQuest. These were things like the Potion Tester, that lets you figure out what kind of potion you have, Thieves' Fingers, which are thin flats you tie to your thumb, fore and middle finger to allow for easier pickpocketing, and Nunchucks, which aren't really devices per se, but the article rightly points out that if you didn't know what they were, you probably wouldn't recognise them as a weapon anyway. Next we have The Key of Tarandor by Mike Polling, or more accurately, Part 2 of The Key of Tarandor, a D&D adventure that started in the previous issue. To quickly summarise what was in issue 49, the adventure was set in a different universe that's a more low fantasy setting where magic is extremely rare and there are no non-human player races. Using pre-made characters, the players must find the pieces of the key to the lost city of Tarandor, and by the end of the first article, they'd gotten to the gates of the city.
Part 2 starts with the players needing to kill some 9-foot-tall guardians before they enter the city, which is mostly an illusion. Once inside, they will be guests of its mad prince, who is initially cordial, but eventually tries to kill the party with his illusions. After those illusions dissipate, there's a big monster to be killed and a dragon to be freed. After which, each player must pick their own path. Alone. To be honest, it's a very interesting adventure, and we're really not doing it any justice by just skimming over it. But it's so dense with detail and world building that to go into any further detail would be to double the length of this video. If it sounds like something you'd want to read up on, then try and track down issues 49 and 50 yourself.
Have Computer Will Travel is an article by Marcus L. Rowland, where it gives you a couple of basic programs, that's basic the language, I'm not being dismissive, to manually type into your microcomputer, as again this was the UK in the 80s. These were meant to help you design vehicles in games like Car Wars.
It's always a little fascinating to me how the relative simplicity of programming in those days meant that it was accessible enough that you could just print a whole program inside of a magazine for people to copy, and that there was enough hobbyist programmers out there to make that worthwhile. Although looking at it does also remind me why I've not touched programming since college.
Next was the letters page, where readers could write in and get their thoughts about the magazine printed, which are a nice way of seeing how the gamers felt about things at the time, although it was frequently used to just complain about Lou Pulsifer's columns. However, there are a couple in here that are worth mentioning. Christine Ogden wrote in to observe that as fun as the art is, it would be nice if more of the women on the covers of White Dwarf were shown with some agency and not just as passive sex objects. Doing so might, attract more women into role-playing, where they are allowed to have a bit more of an even share of the power fantasy. We bring this up because some people like to pretend that the female players of old were always fine with this stuff, and it's only now that people are too sensitive that it's become an issue. Well, here's a female player from 4 decades ago saying it was a problem then too.
The other one was a note from Troy Sagrillo in the USA, who put up a small ad in a previous issue looking for gamers in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, or the Isle of Man. He then apparently received various correspondence telling him that he was a bigot for not including England in that list.
Okay, I know this is incredibly late, but as an Englishman, I just want to apologise to Troy on behalf of what was definitely my countrymen. The English are just kind of like this sometimes, I'm sorry.
Wrapping up the articles, we have a couple more D&D ones. Going Up and an Assassin's Special. Going Up is a discussion about how long it should take a character to level up, which mostly comes down on whatever feels right, but mostly we're distracted by the fact they use the same bit of artwork 3 times, which feels oddly unnerving. An Assassin's Special gave rules for some new equipment specifically for people playing assassins, namely a garrote, some 2-stage poison, the killing cup, a chalice that poisons whatever drink was poured into it, and the dagger of slaying. A magic dagger that only assassins can wield, and indeed good alignment characters would be hurt just by touching its handle. It could instantly kill enemies outright if thrown, provided some personal effect of the target was attached to its hilt beforehand. Also, the blades had their own alignment, and a chaotic evil blade had a 5% chance of looping back around when it was thrown and killing the assassin right back. Which doesn't seem like good odds, but then I once nearly caused a party wipe using a berserker axe, so I guess I'm not one to talk.
Thankfully, since issue 1 there's been a slight improvement in the comics printed in White Dwarf, although that's not exactly a difficult task, and there are 3 comic strips in this issue. The first is Thrud the Barbarian, where he goes to rescue a damsel in distress, only to discover that she wasn't in distress. She was just chasing away a wasp, and the people he killed in order to free her were actually just her family. Which is funny? Maybe? We also get an early gobbledygook strip where he eats a hobbit, so no surprises there. And finally, we get a page of Mark Harrison's The Travelers, a comic based on the game Traveller that is a lot. It's part of a story arc that's basically a riff on the consequences of Han Solo ejecting Jabba's cargo in Star Wars. A little sci-fi, might not have heard of it. Although, good luck figuring that out from just this issue alone. It's part 6 of a 7-part story, and given the chaotic energy of the strip itself, it can take a moment to figure out what's actually going on. If you really want to read this comic, it's all up online with digital colouring that helps a lot in making the strip easier to follow. I can't say I'd recommend doing so, but I mean, you can. If you wanted to. I'm not your dad.
So, the giant riding an elephant in the room is, where is Warhammer? After all, it only came out a year before this, and Citadel did keep adding things to it, so where is it? Well, it does appear. You remember that other advert we mentioned right at the start? Well, that was for Warhammer itself, or more specifically for their upcoming Forces of Fantasy supplement, that gave the game specific army lists and point values. Although it's less of an ad and more just, here's a couple of pages from the upcoming book, which you would have thought would have been in a preview article rather than being placed in the advert, since, you know, it's Warhammer and this is White Dwarf, but at this point White Dwarf was more of a general tabletop gaming magazine rather than a big advert for all of GW's products as it would be later, so there was a bit more distinction between content and advertisement. In that context, yeah, I suppose labelling it as an advert makes sense and would be the ethical thing to do, because it is there to drum up hype for a book that is not yet released.
Anyway, the ad shows off the Dark Elves, who were initially known as Night Elves in the original Warhammer rulebook, and is the first appearance of their Cold One mounts, who look adorable here. It does seem to be the entirety of the Dark Elf section too, so if that's the only bit of the book you needed, then hey, good for you! The back of the magazine is full of adverts for a variety of games and shops. We have something for everybody, I'm sure. And oh hey, there's a bunch of Laserburn stuff in here. Just before all that though was a small ad section which always feels a little quaint, with people looking to buy or sell particular games or magazines, and some people looking for gaming groups, some of which are very normal. And with that, we close the book, or magazine, I guess, on White Dwarf 50. Now, children, what have we learned?
Well, it's a snapshot of a very different Games Workshop that wouldn't exist by the end of the decade. Here we have a magazine for a company that sold a lot of different games by a lot of different companies along with its own products, and the content reflected that. It's why, on the news page, the releases of new Citadel miniatures were on even footing with FASA getting the rights to make a Battlestar Galactica game. Hell, the page even recommends other tabletop gaming magazines for you to read. It shows that there was a brief time before the company relocated to Nottinghamshire and a lot of the old White Dwarf staff left, that they were both the company that had Warhammer and were still committed to supporting other games that were not the sole property of Games Workshop, which is easy to forget as it can almost feel like as soon as GW had Warhammer, that was their entire deal. And it wasn't, it took a little while for that change to happen. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that look at an old magazine, and let us know if you'd like to see us do this more in the future, you know, check in with White Dwarf every 50 issues or so, although we probably won't leave it quite so many years next time.
I mean, we're probably going to do it anyway, but it is always nice to know when you folks are on board too.
Hello there, didn't see you come in. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to help us out, do the stuff. You know, like the video, leave a comment, possibly even a sub if you're that way inclined. If you'd like to join the names that are scrolling past right now who made all of this possible, then you can for as little as $1 over at patreon.com/snipeandwib. Yeah, bye.